Before we begin today's episode, just a reminder to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell if you enjoy this episode. 12-year-old Heather Kullorn was excited to be spending the week with family friends at their apartment. During her time there, she would hang out with the couple while helping look after their 2-month-old baby. Everything was going fine until she mysteriously vanished. Investigators came into what they believed may have been a stranger abduction, but soon evidence discovered in and around the apartment would suggest something far more sinister. The search for Heather revealed that the apartment complex doubled as a methamphetamine lab, and police quickly theorized that the preteen may have been the victim of foul play. A string of contradictory statements, stories with inconsistencies, unreliable witnesses, and a cast of potential suspects with long criminal records hindered the investigation. But the more police searched, the more reasons they found to fear for the child's safety. Was Heather Kullorn the victim of a random abduction, or was the child directly targeted by someone she knew, perhaps because she had seen something that could threaten the entire drug operation? This is Trace Evidence, episode 143, The Abduction of Heather Kullorn. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine a case as mysterious as it is horrible. Before getting into the details, just a few notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. You can follow the show on social media on Twitter at TraceEvPod, Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, or by searching Facebook for Trace Evidence. The show is also on MeWe and Minds. If you're interested in supporting the show and getting some Trace Evidence merch, there's a Patreon available at patreon.com/traceevidence, or you can donate via PayPal. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions there or directly email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. Heather Kullorn was looking forward to spending the week with family friends, looking after their newborn. What was meant to be a fun week turned into a nightmare, which has endured for more than 20 years. This is episode 143. The Abduction of Heather Kullorn. The sun wouldn't rise for another hour, and yet the pavement was already growing warm. It was a steamy July morning when 34-year-old Christopher Herbert stepped out of his car and made the short walk from the garage, drawing his apartment key from his pocket. As he slid the key into the lock, the click of the tumblers was drowned out by the sound of his daughter's cries, echoing inside the residence. As Herbert made his way inside, he quickly discovered his 2-month-old daughter safe, but alone. His mind rapidly turned to Heather, the 12-year-old daughter of a family friend who was supposed to be babysitting. It didn't take long to realize that Heather wasn't in the apartment, and that brought on a new range of concerns. Picking up the phone, Herbert placed a call to his girlfriend and the mother of his child, 23-year-old Dana Madden. Madden had left for work more than 6 hours earlier, employed at the time at a gas station convenience store in nearby St. Louis. After explaining that he had come home to a crying baby and an empty apartment, Madden didn't have an answer as to Heather's whereabouts. Worried, she hung up and dialed 911, notifying police that Heather appeared to be missing. Within 20 minutes, the apartment and surrounding area were crawling with police, who began organizing a search for the missing preteen, which kicked off before sunrise. By the time the sun was up, though, investigators began to realize that there was far more to this case than they had initially imagined. Evidence recovered from the apartment and inconsistencies in witness statements gave rise to the theory that Heather may in fact have been the victim of a violent abduction. The discovery of a drug operation in the complex itself aroused suspicions, and soon police considered the possibility that Heather's disappearance could be directly connected. Detectives developed two important questions they would need to find the answers to. Had Heather stumbled upon the criminal enterprise and been taken to keep her silent? And what details did Herbert possess that he hadn't yet shared? Heather Nicole Kullorn was born on March 9th, 1987 in St. Louis to her mother, Christine. Few details are available regarding Heather's father, though it has been noted that he had not seen her nor been involved in her life since she was very young. Heather was Christine's second child, her older brother Matthew having been born 3 years earlier, making her the baby of the family. The hazel-eyed youngster has been described as having a big personality. Terms like boisterous and spitfire appear in article after article. Family and friends described her as energetic, loving, and mature beyond her years. In at least one instance, she would be described as 12, going on 30. While Heather grew up without her father, she wasn't short on family, as several aunts and uncles lived nearby. In a St. Louis Dispatch article, it's explained that Heather spent a lot of time with her cousins, playing games such as Schoolhouse, which may have fostered her love for children. At a young age, she would push the stroller for her aunt and just loved being around her baby cousin. Heather had an adventurous streak too, with her interest in amusement park rides leading to her obtaining a season pass to Six Flags, which she utilized several times a year. Beyond that, Heather was the type to speak her mind. When talking with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Christine explained her daughter, saying, quote, "She's just a good girl, easygoing. She'll tell you what she thought of you in a minute. She liked to get attention, and she made sure she got it." End quote. Heather began 6th grade in the fall of 1998, though she'd fall ill in the early months of 99. Doctors eventually diagnosed her with type 1 diabetes, and Heather would be required to receive twice-daily insulin injections. This resulted in her missing several weeks of school to the point that she would need to repeat the grade. Unfortunately, she would never have that opportunity. According to Christine, Heather was going through a bit of a rebellious streak by the time she turned 12, and that could create division, but her illness had brought mother and daughter closer together. While surely not a troublemaker, in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, the then 12-year-old had gotten caught smoking a cigarette, which caused quite a commotion, as you might imagine. As Heather began coming into her own as a preteen girl, she started turning her attention slightly towards fashion. She experimented with makeup and hairstyles, and at one point, not long before her disappearance, while trying to pluck her eyebrows, ended up shaving them off completely. While Heather had several friends her own age, she also enjoyed the company of her older relatives and friends of the family. Dana Madden, from whose apartment Heather would disappear, explained that she loved being around the 12-year-old and that they were buddies. Madden recalled how the two loved taking trips to the dollar store together. Prior to meeting Madden, Christopher Herbert had come to know Heather through his on-again, off-again relationship with her mother. Several people described Herbert as being like an uncle to the 12-year-old, though some sources explain that while Heather surely viewed him in this way, Herbert himself could often seem cold or disinterested. In the spring of '99, Herbert and Madden welcomed a child into their life, a baby daughter, and considering her interest in children, it was no surprise that Heather wanted to be around. Heather was excited by the opportunity to babysit for the infant, viewing it as a chance to spend more time around the child while simultaneously exercising her independence and reliability. In July of '99, Heather was living with her mother and brother in an upstairs apartment in the 5000 block of Vermont Avenue in St. Louis. On Saturday, July 10th, Heather was set to spend the week in the Richmond Heights apartment of Madden and Herbert, where she would look after their 2-month-old during the times that no one was home, predominantly in the evenings and supposedly never for long stretches of time. Heather had been there multiple times in the past and enjoyed both looking after the baby as well as spending time with the couple. The apartment building, located at 1646 Yale Avenue, is a U-shaped white brick structure with a small grassy courtyard offering 7 units, listed at 450 square feet. The east side of the building faces Mitchell Avenue, and there are several garages for residents accessible through a rear entrance via the same street, which also provides access to the basement. Christine kept in close contact with Heather to ensure that she had everything she needed, and to make sure she was taking her required insulin injections. In the case of an emergency, the apartment was just over 10 miles away, and Christine could be there in under 15 minutes. Throughout the duration of her stay, as far as has been revealed, there didn't appear to be any issues, and at no point did Heather express worry or concern about being there. Christine later stated in several interviews that she believes her daughter would have told her if she'd seen anything strange or criminal happening. According to Madden, the last time she saw Heather was on the evening of Thursday the 14th. Madden left the apartment at approximately 10 p.m. to work the overnight shift at her job in St. Louis, which would have her arriving home at approximately 7:30. When Madden left, Herbert was still in the apartment, though he would later tell investigators that he left not long after that. Initially, Herbert told police that he had gone down to the banks of the Mississippi River to hang out with a friend, though that story will change multiple times during the course of the investigation. According to Herbert, when he left, Heather was in good spirits, and there didn't appear to be any reason for concern. What transpired over the course of the next 6 hours has been the subject of a lot of heated debate and suspicion. The full truth of those hours has yet to be discovered. Sometime after 4 a.m., Herbert arrived home and discovered Heather missing. Rather than calling her mother to ask if she'd picked her up or notifying authorities right away, he instead called Madden at work. While the exact details of that conversation have never been disclosed, there are two varying accounts. In one, Herbert called to ask if Madden might know where Heather had gone, and after realizing she was missing, Madden made the choice to call police. In another, the two engaged in an argument which resulted in Madden hanging up and calling to report the 12-year-old missing. There seems to be some discrepancies in the timeline, though most official sources report that the first investigators arrived at the scene at or just after 5 a.m., approximately 30 to 45 minutes after Herbert came home. Both the Richmond Heights police as well as the major case squad were involved from the beginning. More than 40 officers were on the scene within the first hour, examining the apartment, questioning Madden and Herbert while searching for Heather and canvassing the area for anyone who may have seen or heard anything. The apartment yielded several troubling clues, and police quickly ruled out the possibility that Heather had gone off on her own, instead believing that she had been forcibly abducted. While the apartment showed no signs of forced entry, investigators found blood on the floor, on the couch, and on the wall, as well as in a small patch of grass behind the building. At the time, authorities couldn't confirm whether the blood belonged to Heather, as they had to await test results, though they were able to rule out the blood behind the building. A resident of the complex told police that the blood belonged to him and he'd been bitten by a dog earlier. According to the Post-Dispatch, police noted that several items inside the apartment appeared to have been out of place, though they didn't give specifics as to whether there had been any items stolen or if this was indicative of a struggle. However, they did go into detail regarding one missing item. An off-white comforter with faded flowers quilted onto it appeared to be missing from the apartment. This detail became important early on during canvassing. While multiple residents reported hearing the sounds of a baby crying throughout the early morning hours, only one had actually seen something. A neighbor stepped out of his apartment at approximately 2 a.m. to walk his dog. While making his way back to the apartment, the witness saw an unidentified man exiting the apartment carrying what appeared to be a sleeping child wrapped in a white comforter. According to the witness, the child's upper body was concealed beneath the blanket, though he did note that her legs were hanging out and she was not wearing shoes. These details made an already desperate search that much more concerning. In addition to the evidence found at the scene, police were worried for Heather's physical well-being as she needed her daily insulin injections, but all of her medical supplies had been left behind. While police had hoped the witness might be able to give them a firm description to work with, details were somewhat hazy. It has since been reported that the witness had bad eyesight, so bad that he was legally blind without glasses, and at the time he saw the man carrying the child, he wasn't wearing those glasses. The only description given was that the man was of medium height. Investigators reached out to the FBI for assistance, and several agents joined the investigation within the first 24 hours. From nearly their first interview with Christopher Herbert, police felt he wasn't being completely honest with them. After filing the missing persons report, Herbert was taken into custody on an unrelated traffic violation, during which time police were able to speak with him multiple times. In a short span, Herbert gave several different accounts of his actions the night Heather went missing. Initially, he claimed he had left the apartment at approximately 10:30 p.m. to drive a friend home, though police wondered why he had been gone for 6 hours if that was the case. Herbert later admitted that this statement was false and produced a second scenario, that he had left the apartment to party with a friend on the banks of the Mississippi. This would not be the last change in his story. After bonding out from his traffic violation, Herbert was informed by police that they would be speaking with him again. For her part, police were able to verify that Madden had in fact been at work during the time Heather was taken. Christine was devastated by the disappearance of her daughter, and from the beginning argued that Madden, Herbert, or both had more information than they were sharing. She believed that one of them knew what happened to Heather, and her opinion would remain the same over the years. In hopes of finding her daughter, Christine enlisted friends and family who scoured the city searching for the 12-year-old. Missing persons flyers were quickly produced and spread through the area. Stop signs, light poles, and store windows were wallpapered with the flyer bearing Heather's image and her description of her. At the time, the mystery was about Heather's abductor. Was this a random crime, or was there some connection? Within days of her disappearance, police came to a conclusion. By Saturday the 16th, investigators ruled out the stranger situation, with Major Case Squad Commander Baker telling the Netscape blog, quote, "Usually when you have a stranger abduction, you would have someone hearing screams," end quote. As a result of this, police began looking at people who knew Heather directly, as well as friends and acquaintances of Madden and Herbert. There was, of course, another detail of the investigation which gave it a completely different angle. Following their search of the apartment, police spread out and conducted a thorough search of the entire complex. In a garage, accessible by Herbert, police found equipment and supplies used in the manufacturing of methamphetamine. This gave rise to a theory that Heather may have seen the operation and perhaps had been targeted when someone involved became concerned that she would reveal that secret. One of the first people police sought to question was Mike Mason, a friend of Herbert's who lived in an apartment across the street and who had known and been around Heather. Early in the morning, Herbert arrived with an investigator in tow to speak with Mason. The officer questioned him about Heather, but he denied any knowledge of what might have happened. Mason gave police permission to search his apartment, which they did, though no evidence was recovered to connect him to the abduction. During their investigation, police discovered that Mason also had access to the garage in which meth had been produced, and soon came to realize that both Mason and Herbert had been involved in manufacturing and distributing the drug. According to police, it was quite clear from early on that Herbert, Mason, and Madden were all using meth at the time of Heather's abduction and had been for some time. Mason later stated in an interview that Heather had been around when they were using meth, saying, quote, "That girl had seen a lifetime of stuff," end quote. Authorities would later report that, despite knowing they were being watched by investigators, the trio continued using meth during the investigation, though Madden denied any knowledge of drug use or manufacturing. Mason later told reporters that he was polygraphed by police and passed, though investigators would not comment on the results of that test. Curiously, It was later reported that an unidentified suspect failed a polygraph, though whether or not that was Mason has never been confirmed or denied. Mason later commented that in the days after Heather's abduction, he noticed toe chains were missing from his vehicle, and he went on to speculate that someone could have wrapped Heather in them and placed her in the Mississippi River. Though results of a DNA test had not yet been returned, by Sunday, July 18th, police told the Post-Dispatch they believed the blood found in the apartment belonged to Heather. The amount discovered was not enough for police to conclude that it was the result of a fatal wound, but instead a less lethal injury. Test results would later confirm this, proving that the blood was Heather's. At the same time, Chief Robert Lowry Jr. of the Florissant Police Department told reporters that while no one had been officially ruled out, they were not at the same time looking at either Herbert or Madden as potential suspects in the abduction. That same weekend, more than 30 investigators went to different areas of Missouri to question people who were connected to Heather, though they would not specify who they were talking with. We do know that they searched farmland south of St. Louis in Jefferson County. When asked about this, Chief Lowry replied, quote, "Some of the people familiar with the family live in Jefferson County," end quote. By Monday, July 19th, police publicly expressed their concern that Heather had likely been the victim of a homicide, though they didn't go into much detail as to what led them to that conclusion. Local businesses, in hopes of helping find answers, chipped in to create a $10,000 reward for any information leading to Heather's whereabouts or an arrest. Detectives told the Post-Dispatch that they believe Heather had likely been abducted and killed by someone who either knew Herbert and Madden or perhaps her mother, Christine. On Tuesday, July 20th, police recovered a white blanket fitting the description of the one missing from the apartment. The blanket, found in a park approximately 10 miles from the apartment near the banks of the Mississippi River, was brought to Dana Madden, though she told investigators it was not the same blanket. While police had no way to argue against this, it has been noted as curious since the blanket was found in the park bordering the river, while Herbert had previously told police that he had been on the banks of the river during the time Heather was taken. I should also note the location of this park is less than 1 mile from the apartment Heather shared with her mother and brother. While police were continuing to investigate around the clock, they weren't coming up with much. No information was leading to frustration for both them and Heather's family. The hope had been that investigators would be able to locate Heather, but by the 25th, 10 days after she was abducted, they hadn't discovered any details to lead them to her, nor to point the finger at anyone in particular. Sergeant Rick Vilchek of the Richmond Heights Police Department explained to the Post-Dispatch, quote, "Here you have the cream of the crop of investigators, and you're using all your resources and doing the best you humanly can, and then you come up blank." End quote. Christine, who was driven to find her daughter, was admittedly exhausted and drained by the circumstances. Deprived of sleep, not eating, and heartbroken, she replaced the outgoing message on her answering machine with a desperate plea for Heather's safe return. Family and friends came to support her, bringing food and helping take care of any tasks that might be required. But for Christine, each passing day was another step closer to a dark reality that she may never see her daughter again. 11 days after Heather vanished, police announced that the major case squad would continue investigating until the end. During this announcement, Chief Lowry revealed several details that had been uncovered. Firstly, it was stated that many people in Heather's life had been involved in either the production or use of methamphetamine. While no names were given, an official confirmed that 3 people Heather knew had recently been arrested on drug charges, and they expected 9 others would be brought in soon. Police also acknowledged that they had narrowed down their pool of potential suspects, describing it as a handful, and that their prime suspect, who they did not name, had failed a polygraph test. When asked whether or not any family members were being looked at, Lowry told the Post-Dispatch that they had questioned several family members more than once and that those individuals were aware they were being looked at closely. On Tuesday, July 27th, it was announced that police strongly believed Heather's abduction and likely murder was directly connected to a major methamphetamine ring, described as stretching from St. Louis to the Missouri boot heel. New information divulged to the Post-Dispatch included the detail that at least one person involved in the drug ring was cooking meth in the apartment complex garage the night Heather was abducted. It was also announced at this time that a St. Charles County-based rescue team was planning an operation to search the Mississippi River for any signs of Heather in the area near the park where the blanket had been found. This search was executed on Wednesday, July 28th, though it appears nothing was found. Investigators from the Major Case Squad once again questioned Herbert, getting two different stories this time. In his first explanation of his whereabouts the night of the crime, Herbert stuck with his story about being on the banks of the river partying with a friend, though this time he went further, saying that he was in fact smoking meth with that friend. However, court documents later obtained by the Post-Dispatch provide a different account given by Herbert. In this account, Herbert explained that he was present in the apartment complex garage the night Heather was abducted and was cooking meth with an associate. According to his statement, he left the garage at approximately 10:30 p.m. to obtain additional supplies to cook more meth and didn't return until 6 hours later, at which time he discovered Heather was missing and he found the blood on the couch, floor, and walls. I don't know where he went to get those supplies, but 6 hours seems like a long trip. Herbert provided additional information regarding his associate, telling investigators that the man was dating a woman who was the owner of a red BMW and that he had in the past stolen both money and meth from that vehicle. According to his statement, when he returned to the apartment that morning to find Heather missing, the woman, her boyfriend, and the BMW were also gone. Apparently, a note had also been left behind telling him that they wanted back the merchandise he had stolen from them. Police acknowledged that they had tracked down the boyfriend, as well as the vehicle, which they had obtained a warrant to search. The BMW was taken in by police for testing, and it's noted in the article that investigators specifically stated their belief that the car was, quote, directly involved in the kidnapping and abduction of Heather Kullorn, end quote. Nearly 2 weeks later, on Friday, August 13th, investigators announced they were seeking assistance from the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, which operates within the FBI. Federal agents reviewed all evidence and reports, visited the scene of the crime, and were aiming to release their own report, which would give a profile of what type of suspect police should be searching for. For investigators, the case was beginning to slip away, and they wanted to do everything they could to reignite the search. Sergeant Vilcek told the Post-Dispatch, quote, "We simply don't know where she's at right now. As time goes on, it certainly seems apparent that the worst has happened. But as human beings, we have to continue to be hopeful." End quote. When asked about the search of the red BMW, investigators would not release any details of what was found or not found. Unfortunately, time began passing more rapidly, with few, if any, new leads. On Monday, November 22nd, friends and family held a church service for Heather, who had now been missing for 130 days. Christine was clear that the service was not a funeral, telling the Post-Dispatch, quote, "I'll never give up till I find her alive. She's my baby, and I'm going to find her someday." End quote. The reward for information was increased from $10,000 to $35,000 after a donation from the Class Kids Foundation. On March 9th, 2000, what would have been Heather's 13th birthday, Christine spent her day in Mount Hope Cemetery at her mother's grave. The day held a double meaning, being both Heather's birthday and the 6-year anniversary of her mother's death. For Christine, the 8 months since Heather vanished had been the most difficult of her life. She explained to the Post-Dispatch, quote, "I'm just not the same person anymore. I'm mean to a lot of people. I think because I'm just so aggravated. I know there's a handful of people who know what happened, and they don't have the decency to say anything, even anonymously." End quote. Christine went on to explain that her family had been receiving attacks from people accusing them of killing Heather for insurance money, perhaps in response to her application to the Missouri Crime Victims Fund, which was denied. An official response explained, in part, quote, "The act which gave rise to the claim does not constitute a crime. The claim can be reopened when a body is found." End quote. Investigators acknowledged that the case was ongoing and their suspect pool was down to approximately 12 people, though those people were not being very cooperative. It was revealed, however, that they had continued to receive tips about the case, and on several occasions had sent cadaver dogs to search several St. Louis area basements as well as along the banks of the Mississippi. Things came to a bitter head for Christine a month later. On Friday, April 25th, she was arrested and charged with disturbing the peace for an incident which took place at a 7-Eleven. Christine managed to track down Dana Madden, who was working at the location, and engaged her in a verbal altercation. Reportedly, Madden went into the back room of the business and refused to come out, ultimately calling police who arrested Christine. At the same time, it was noted that Christopher Herbert was serving time at a medium security institution after being charged with second-degree arson related to an incident which occurred the previous September, 2 months after Heather had been abducted. In March of 2002, the remains of a female child were discovered in a creek bed near St. Louis. Initially, investigators thought they might have found Heather. However, Christine was unable to identify the clothing the victim had been wearing. Testing later proved that the remains did not belong to Heather, which allowed Christine to keep up her hope that someday her daughter would return to her safe and alive. But that hope was admittedly becoming more difficult to hang on to. That same month, friends and family once again returned to Christine's mother's grave for what would have been Heather's 16th birthday. The weight of all those years of not knowing was clearly weighing on Christine as she spoke to the Post-Dispatch, explaining, quote, "Every birthday, every holiday, it just gets harder. I always wonder. You have a lot of things going through your head. Sometimes it feels like I'm fighting a losing battle." End quote. Richmond Heights Police Chief Ron Pfeiffer told the media that the case was still being worked and tips were still being received. He then made a startling admission, saying, quote, "We believe we know who is responsible, but we're hoping to get the break that will lead us to the evidence." End quote. A year later, in April of 2003, the Sean Hornbeck Foundation became involved in Heather's case, sending search dogs to examine a location in St. Louis County based on a tip Christine had received. The foundation was named after Sean Hornbeck, who was abducted on October 6, 2002, and aimed to assist in both the search for Sean as well as to help families of other missing children. While this particular search did not yield results in Heather's case, the foundation also operated a program called Sitting with an Angel, which installed benches that displayed information about missing children. The first bench dedicated in the program was for Heather Kullorn. In January of 2007, Sean Hornbeck was found alive, and his captor and abuser, Mike Devlin, was arrested. Devlin had abducted Hornbeck and kept him as a prisoner for just over 4 years. He was later sentenced to 72 life terms. While Christine felt elation for Sean's parents, unfortunately, Heather's case continued to grow stagnant. In August of 2008, 9 years after her abduction, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department held a rally to bring attention to missing people in the area. Heather was included on this list, and it was hoped this would continue to keep her name in the headlines, but that glimmer of media coverage was short-lived. 6 years later, July 15th, 2014 marked 15 years since Heather was taken. She would have been 27 years old, and while her case seemed to be fading, investigators insisted they were keeping their eyes on suspects and simply needed a break, a piece of evidence to make an arrest. Christine was critical of their approach, feeling that they hadn't done enough to try and find her daughter. She continued putting up flyers and fighting to keep Heather's name in the limelight, but as time passed, community investment dropped off. Christine told the Post-Dispatch, quote, "I just keep trying to keep her name out there, even if I'm just talking about her with someone. I feel like I'm doing something then. Some days it's hard, some days I give up, but I do it because Heather deserved justice." End quote. On December 16th, 2017, Christine Kullorn tragically passed away at the age of 52. She fought to try and find justice for her daughter, but that has continued to remain out of reach. For 18 years, she suffered with not knowing, with suspicion, with a belief, but without the evidence to support it. It's also poignant to note that, in her obituary, it is listed that she is survived by Heather, acknowledging that she never relinquished hope that her daughter would return home alive. That same year, Detective Mike Brown took part in a radio interview in which he specified that they have two suspects, two people they have been following for the past few years. While the suspects have never been named, he described them as having been in and out of the prison system for crimes over the years, and while investigators believe they are responsible for Heather's abduction and murder, they have never had the evidence they need to make an arrest. It was his hope that either through the discovery of new evidence, or perhaps a tip, anonymous or otherwise, they might finally be able to not only get justice for Heather, but to lay her to rest beside her mother. When last seen, Heather Nicole Kullorn was described as being a Caucasian female with brown hair and hazel eyes, standing 4 feet 10 inches tall and weighing 87 pounds. She was last seen wearing green plaid shorts and a dark blue cut-off t-shirt with an emblem. Her ears are pierced multiple times. She has a birthmark on her inner right thigh, and her eyebrows had been shaved at the time of her disappearance. Heather suffers from type 1 diabetes and requires 2 insulin shots per day, though her medical supplies had been left behind. If alive today, Heather would be 33 years old, and age-progressed photographs are available, though police do believe she was likely the victim of a homicide. She was last seen in the 1600 block of Yale Avenue in Richmond Heights, Missouri on July 15th, 1999. This July will mark 22 years since Heather Kullorn was abducted. Over all that time, while her family has suffered and grieved, those responsible for her disappearance and likely murder have continued to live their lives, though, for the most part, not well. Many who have been considered to be possibly linked to the case have been in and out of prison, or worse. Dana Madden maintains she has no knowledge of what happened to Heather and has expressed her hope that she's someday found. Christopher Herbert has stated he knows nothing about what happened to Heather and was in no way involved. Mike Mason has said he hopes this case will someday see arrests and a trial. As for who the prime suspect or suspects are, police have never revealed that, and whether or not we ever find out seems based completely on whether or not the evidence can be found. Christine Kullorn desperately wished to see her daughter brought home and her killer behind bars. She's no longer here to be witness to that, but that doesn't mean it's too late to see it done in her stead. More than 2 decades have passed, and if there's one thing we know for sure, it's that someone knows what happened. Someone holds the truth, and that person possesses the ability to help assuage the grief of Heather's family. Make a call, send an email, a letter, do it anonymously. No one cares as long as the information can be used to put a child killer behind bars. In an interview, a few years before her death, Christine made a desperate plea, asking, quote, "You don't have to give your name, just give me my daughter. Somebody out there has got to know where she is, and if they have a heart, they'll bring her home." The abduction of Heather Kullorn is one of those cases that, no matter how many times you examine it, no matter how much you research it, there's always some details that lead you to anger, sorrow, and frustration. A 12-year-old girl who wants to help, loves children, and has a strong and caring personality vanishes in the middle of the night, leaving behind a series of cryptic clues which, while not telling the whole story, gives you enough information to dread her fate. Any case involving a child is hard to bear, but one in which an innocent child finds herself surrounded by dangerous people is both heartbreaking and infuriating. From very early, police determined this wasn't a random crime. It wasn't a matter of someone knocking on the door and grabbing Heather. The more information they uncovered, the more the harsh truth became clear. Someone targeted the 12-year-old, and while her family has held out hope that she may yet be found alive, police are almost certain that her life was extinguished sometime between 10:30 p.m. and 4 a.m. that July night in 1999. This is a difficult case to examine, at least from the perspective of theories. Investigators have been incredibly tight-lipped about their suspects, and while they've made it clear over the years that they have two specific people in mind, we don't know which two they're focused on or what information they possess that makes it a solid link. In the absence of that knowledge, we are left to look at what we do know, to try and sort our way through the absolute chaos of contradictions, lies, and rumors. There are essentially three theories in this case, though in some instances those theories overlap. Where one person could be viewed as a potential suspect from one angle, they might be innocent or perhaps a co-conspirator in the murder of a child and the cover-up of the crime itself. For many people, the answer lies close to the apartment and one or both of its occupants, Christopher Herbert and Dana Madden. For others, the truth might be found across the street in the presence of Mike Mason. And for others still, they believe the mysterious couple in the red BMW might hold all the answers. Perhaps, though, it could be a combination of two or all three. So let's begin where we know the least. The man and woman with the BMW. We don't have a lot of information here, and what we do have is confusing, to say the least. According to Herbert, after admitting that he was both involved in the manufacturing and sale of meth, these two were directly involved with that drug ring. On the one hand, Herbert says that he had stolen from the couple, namely cash and meth. On the other, he claims to have been cooking meth with one of them. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense that he'd steal from one of them one day and work with them the next, nor that they would want to work with him, but maybe in the world of meth cooking, you take what options you have. Now, Herbert has claimed that he was cooking meth in the garage that night, and at approximately 10:30 p.m. he went out to pick up supplies for more. For reasons passing understanding, he didn't return for 6 hours, and by that time, the man and woman were gone, and so was Heather. We'll get into Herbert's whereabouts when we look at his theory, but for now, let's stay with the couple. Apparently, they were angry with Herbert, angry enough that they left a note behind saying they wanted back what he had stolen from them. Speculation has led some to believe that this note may have been underscored by Heather's disappearance, a little way of saying, this time we took your babysitter, but next time it might be your own daughter. Let's face it, the drug world is a violent and brutal place to be, and when you're making enemies with people involved in it, you don't know what they're capable of. I don't think it's an impossibility that Heather could have been taken to send a message. A lot of people think that, but we run into problems when we look into the investigation itself. We know police know these people's identities. We know they tracked them down, seized the vehicle, and went through it with a fine-tooth comb, looking for any evidence linking that BMW to Heather's abduction. They've never revealed what the results of that search were, but the smart money says if they'd found anything that could confirm Heather had been in that car, we'd likely have seen results. an arrest, the naming of persons of interest, but that didn't happen here. The sheer fact that their names have never been disclosed leads some to believe they're innocent. Others theorize that perhaps investigators want to keep things as under wraps as they possibly can to protect the integrity of the investigation. The truth is, there's not enough here to really know one way or the other. Police have said it's their belief that whoever took Heather was likely someone she knew and trusted. Otherwise, they'd expect neighbors to have heard screaming. We don't know if Heather knew any of these people or not, but given that they had an adverse relationship with Herbert and didn't live in the area, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that she did. Or maybe if she did, she'd have known that they were a threat. The details of the scene seem clear. No forced entry, some kind of physical violence inside that left blood behind, a child wrapped in a comforter and carried off. Would Heather have opened the door to a stranger or someone she knew to be a threat? Hell, if Herbert believed these two were capable of something like this, would he have left for more than 6 hours knowing only Heather was there to look out for his infant daughter? My rational mind says no, but I've never done meth, so I'm not sure what kind of thinking or lack thereof it leads to. So, could it have been them? Absolutely. The problem comes down to evidence, and if police found any, they've kept it under their lids for more than 20 years. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I'd imagine if they found anything that put Heather in that car, we'd know by now. Of course, these two have never really been mentioned as being directly connected to Heather, and investigators were fairly certain that whoever committed this crime knew her enough that she likely would have trusted them. So that brings us to the next person on the list, Mike Mason. According to Mason's own interview statements, not only was he friends with Herbert and involved in the drug operation, but he knew Heather, had hung around her, and was friendly to her. In fact, he was the first person Herbert led investigators to after he himself had been questioned. Now, I don't know if that's just because Herbert suspected Mason's involvement, knew something more than he shared, or was just leading police to anyone in the area that knew her, but the bizarre nature of Mason's relationship with the 12-year-old doesn't end there. In his interview, Mason made it clear that not only was Heather aware of the drug use happening, they often used drugs in her presence. Mason stated that he had taken a polygraph for the police and that he had passed, but that was never confirmed. We do know that at least one person was given a polygraph and failed, but I also find it difficult to imagine Mason was the only person ever tested. Plus, I think I've made my opinions on polygraphs pretty clear over the past 142 episodes. In several different discussions with the media, police emphasized the fact that people using meth can often become violent, and we know Mason was surely using at that time. Unfortunately, it appears almost everyone around Heather was using. I suppose a key detail that makes Mason stand out to a lot of people is his statement about his toe chains. It seems like a bizarre thing to say, that days later he noticed his toe chains were missing, and instead of thinking someone just stole them, and instead of imagining someone might have taken them to get money for meth or as revenge against him for something, he immediately suggests that someone may have wrapped Heather in chains and put her in the Mississippi River. When you factor in that several searches have happened along the banks and in the river itself, it does make this statement seem more suspicious. I've seen in several places people discussing the possibility that the attack against Heather may have not been inspired by revenge per se, but completely due to the influence of meth. If Heather was specifically targeted, then you've got to be looking for someone who not only knew she was in the apartment, but also knew she was alone. Would Mason's friendship with Herbert have made him privy to that information? Maybe. He lived across the street, had an established rapport with Heather, and I couldn't find in any place I looked a single piece of information about his alibi, his whereabouts during the time she was abducted. All we know is that he's been questioned, he's been polygraphed, he had access to the complex, and he cooked meth in the same garage. In several places, it's been said that Mason worked doing repairs at the complex, and I can't help but wonder if that meant he had keys to those apartments. So, It's not difficult to see why Mason has been considered a potential person of interest by so many people, but we ultimately come back to a similar dead end as we did in the previous theory. We know police searched Mason's apartment and apparently didn't find anything to put Heather there. We know he had a car, and while I haven't found anything to confirm it, police probably searched it, especially if they were given permission to search his apartment. And if he had denied them the ability to search his car, that probably would have been mentioned somewhere. So again, a possibility, but just not enough information to be able to know for sure one way or the other. That leads us, ultimately, to the two people who were not only closest to Heather out of this whole group, but the ones who lived in the apartment she disappeared from. One of the few things in this case that we know for a fact is that Dana Madden was not home when Heather was taken. She was working an overnight shift, and police were able to confirm her alibi. While for many, this makes them believe she wasn't involved in the crime, and I tend to agree, it doesn't mean that she couldn't possess some knowledge about what happened, or at least have a pretty good guess. Christine believes she knew more, so much so that she was willing to get arrested to confront her about it. Madden, over the years, has denied knowing what happened and expressed that she cared a great deal for Heather and was crushed when she was abducted. At the same time, she's also acknowledged that she was using a lot of meth at the time. So that leaves us with Christopher Herbert, perhaps the most confusing and mysterious character in this whole sordid story. So let's begin with what we know. Herbert was home when Madden left for work, making him the last person to officially see Heather alive. The one consistent factor about his story is that at 10:30 p.m., he left the area. Whether he left to go hang out at the river, or left to go do meth at the river, or was cooking meth in the garage and left to get supplies, he says he left at 10:30. Most people tend to believe the cooking meth story, as it seems unlikely he'd incriminate himself in that way if it wasn't true, but I have a really hard time buying that it took him 6 hours to finish gathering supplies. Then again, I've never made meth, so I really don't know how involved that would be, but still, it just doesn't sync up for me. According to Herbert, he arrived home sometime between 4 and 4:30 a.m. when he discovered Heather missing. His first call is to Madden. A lot of people view this as suspicious, but for me, I think it kind of makes sense. Maybe Heather had called her, maybe there was an issue, maybe Madden might be able to provide an answer. Now, depending which angle of the conversation you believe, it was either a quick call followed by a 911 call, or it led to an argument that resulted in the same missing person's call. I tend to lean towards the argument. While it's purely speculative, I could imagine a situation in which Madden says they have to call the police, and Herbert doesn't necessarily want to because they're gonna find a meth operation plus any paraphernalia that's in the apartment. Either way, when police arrive, Herbert tells the first of his many different versions of events. Now, there's a couple of things here. Firstly, I can't help but wonder if saying he was down at the river was a calculated statement, because if perhaps Heather did end up in the Mississippi and he was involved, someone could have seen him there. So saying he was at the river could have been a cover-up whereby a witness would only confirm his alibi if they saw him. But maybe not. Maybe it was just the first thing he thought of. Either way, I think the fact remains his alibi, whichever one you choose, can't be verified. His final story involved cooking meth and leaving for supplies. There's never been any information released to suggest that anyone could support that. There's been no account of him being seen out during those hours, but there's also no accounts of him being seen at home during that time. Unfortunately, the one eyewitness who saw the abductor was legally blind without his glasses, so he couldn't really make out who he was looking at, and even if he could, that wouldn't stand up in court. Now, if in fact Heather was taken out of the apartment at 2 a.m., that leaves a gap of 3.5 hours from 10:30 when Herbert says he left. Obviously, a lot of different things could have happened during that time, but they're all speculative. Some people believe if Herbert was involved, something could have transpired that led him to harming Heather. There's a lot of different theories, but the most popular seems to be that Herbert might have made unwanted advances on her, and her resistance led to violence. Another is that Herbert may have been high on meth, grew angry over something, and lashed out at Heather. Honestly, it's all too much to consider. The fact is, unless Herbert has been at some point confirmed by police to have been present in the apartment after 10:30, then he would have the opportunity. It was his apartment and there were no signs of forced entry. If Heather was taken out at 2 a.m., the Mississippi River is a 15-minute drive to the east, and returning home between 4 and 4:30 gives him 2 to 2.5 hours to cover up the crime, at least to some degree. Blood was found in the apartment, the comforter was missing, so maybe if there was a cover-up, it just wasn't very well done. Then again, no one's ever been charged, so maybe it was very well done. It's also interesting that Herbert didn't seem to do anything to try and conceal the meth situation before calling Madden. If he had committed the crime, why not give himself some time to clean up before making that call? Well, maybe he thought Madden would go along with the plan, or maybe he just wasn't thinking straight. It's difficult to believe in someone's innocence when they tell so many different stories, but in this case, you have to try and figure out, were the lies told to cover up the crime, or were they told to try and cover up connections to the drug ring? That we may never know for sure. We know there was blood in the apartment. Logic would dictate police didn't find any of Heather's blood on Herbert's body or clothing. Sure, he could have changed and showered, but there's always the risk that he'd missed something. So, there's a couple of different ways it's been suggested things could have gone down if Herbert was involved. Either he commits the crime and goes out on his own to take care of it, or he seeks help. Maybe he goes across the street to Mason, says he needs his toe chains, or flat out explains the situation and says he needs help covering it up. That's a possibility that can't be completely ignored. Then there are those who believe Herbert didn't commit the crime, but knows more about it than he shared. So reverse the situation. Mason commits the crime, tells Herbert he has to help. Maybe he doesn't want to, but he's told that if he doesn't help, then he's going to be told on about his meth situation. Hell, I've not ruled out the possibility that something happened, and to provide plausible deniability, Herbert is told to leave the complex for a few hours. Surely that's possible. I think the one major issue I have when it comes to both Herbert and Mason is plea bargains. Mason later served several years in federal prison on drug charges. Wouldn't that be a good time to make a deal for information about Heather if you knew what happened? The same could be said for Herbert, who goes in and out of prison a few times. Not to mention, we're talking about two people who frequently use meth. I find it hard to believe they would have never blabbed about this situation to someone. While there's surely a possibility that Madden could know the truth, there's also a part of me that feels like Herbert wouldn't tell her if he knew, because it seems like she wouldn't be willing to go along with it. So what do you think happened here? Do you think the red BMW couple were involved, or was that something thrown out to cast suspicion on people Herbert had issues with? Does Mason know more than he shared, or was he maybe involved? Is Madden hiding the truth to protect Herbert or herself? Was Herbert involved? If not, does he know who was and just hasn't said so? Or do you think maybe the answer could lie in someone who has never been mentioned during any official statements regarding this case? No matter what way you slice it, I firmly believe more than one person out there knows the truth. Why those people have remained silent all these years, I can't begin to guess unless they were involved. There's been a $35,000 reward for information, and no one has cashed in on it. Either there's a lot of people with information who chose not to share it, or this crime was committed efficiently enough where nobody knows except the person or persons involved. At the end of the day, a 12-year-old disappeared and was likely killed for no reason. What, to cover up a drug operation? Mason himself has said Heather knew what was going on and had been around it, so why the need to go so far? I suppose when you factor in the meth, you really have no way of knowing what someone might do, what might set them off, what might transform a single comment into an excuse for murder. Heather Kullorn vanished from the apartments on Yale Avenue in July of 1999. For nearly 22 years, the truth of her fate and the location of her remains have been kept quiet. Police have two suspects who they firmly believe committed this crime. All they lack is evidence to support it. All of this could be ended, Heather brought home, justice served, if only someone would tell what they know, deliver the last piece of this puzzle, and end this horrible story. Unfortunately, until that happens or new evidence is discovered, the abduction and likely murder of Heather Kullorn will remain open, unsolved, and growing cold. If you're looking for more information about the abduction of Heather Kullorn, there are several forums and posts discussing her case. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch has done many extensive and detailed articles without which this episode would not have been possible. Heather is listed in NamUs as MP6275, as well as in NCMEC, case number 867123. If you have any information about the abduction of Heather Kullorn, please contact the Richmond Heights Police Department at 314-645-3000. You can also contact NCMEC at 1-800-THE-LOST. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, message me on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. Trace Evidence would not be possible without the support of amazing listeners like you. Now I'd like to take a moment to thank our amazing Patreon producers: Alicia Lorraine, Brittany Bivens, Brian Kemmerling, Christine Greco, Krista Colvin, Dierthy, Denise Dingsdale, Diane Dyson, Eamon Brady, James, Jennifer Winkler, Joni Berkowitz, Kevin Bonham, Marla Wright, Melissa Breckeisen, Michael Draves, Nick Mohar Schurz, Roberta Jansen, Sarah Levanon, Sarah Mascaritolo, Travis Sepsko, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Tom Archer, Tom Radford, and Tracy Woods. Your contributions to Trace Evidence are invaluable, and your support of the show is both appreciated and humbling. If you're interested in supporting Trace Evidence, getting cool merch, and having access to commercial-free episodes, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence. I want to thank you for listening to the first episode of 2021, a new year with new possibilities and hopefully one which will be filled with unsolved cases being resolved. So thank you again for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.